Hello, everyone, and my apologies for having a rough start to our semester. But I just got back from taking my daughter to school, and I hope you all just stayed home today because it's fairly dangerous out, and I wish CSU would have just canceled school today. But it worked out, I think, fairly well that we had to move this online, considering the road conditions out. So I'm just going to record hopefully a relatively short video to introduce the class and material and some things coming up so you can get started in reading and working on stuff for next week. All right, let's just get into it. So this is tree ecophysiology of trees. I really just call it ecophysiology. We're going to talk about all plants. We'll talk about some special considerations in trees, but really what we talk about applies to all functional groups. Okay, so briefly about myself, you can just call me Troy. I am a plant ecophysiologist. I've worked in a lot of different ecosystems. I've worked in temperate rainforests and desert ecosystems and grasslands and shrublands. And so when I mentioned just a second ago that we'll talk about different functional groups, that's really my interest, is how different functional groups, or why different functional groups are different. What are the implications of a plant being part of a different functional group? And so part of that interest, I think, comes from the fact that I've been lucky enough to work in different places and observe those different functional groups. And so that's kind of my focus, or one of my research foci. I'm interested in the mechanisms and thresholds of mortality. That's one of the major themes in my lab. Is we do a lot of pushing plants to the brink of survival and seeing what that threshold is. Historically, that's been primarily related to drought and water limitation, but more recently we've been doing work on heat tolerance, both in regards to heat waves, but also fires. And then there's other aspects of the research in the lab as well. But those are kind of primary interests that have been continuous throughout the time I've been here at CSU. Okay, we'll get to know each other much more throughout the semester, so I won't go into more detail now. Let me just move my picture. Sorry. That way it doesn't cover our header. Let's just talk briefly about plant ecophysiology, and then we'll talk more specifically about the class. So plant ecophysiology it has a few different names, but you can kind of tell it's just squashing physiology and ecology together. Sometimes it's called ecological physiology, and sometimes it's called physiological ecology, and then sometimes it's called ecophysiology, and we often just call it ecophys. One thing that's to me is interesting to me about ecophysiology is that it spans this huge range of scales. And I guess what I mean by it, like ecophysiology, is the field of ecophysiology has people in it that consider themselves, either ecophysiologists or working in ecophysiology, but it's really a large spectrum of kind of the scale they work on. So, for example, there's a lot of people that work more on the physiology side of things, even cellular physiology. Some of what we do in the lab is studying the structure and size of different individual cells and how that causes a plant to function under different scenarios. So I tend to think of myself more as a physiologist. And then on the other end of the spectrum are people thinking about really broad scale ecological patterns, even on the global scale, but thinking about it from the lens of how plants are functioning and adapting to different environmental conditions. So it goes across that entire range. So let's go back to the name for a second, ecophysiology. It's really based in the physiology of plants and understanding that physiology, which can be really detailed in small scale, like that cellular physiology. But then it's taking that understanding of those physiological principles and figuring out how those principles impact the ecology of the plants on the landscape. So it's mushing these two together. And since they've been mushed together in this one field, it's not surprising that people work at different scales within that kind of umbrella of ecophysiology. So in general, just to help you start to get to understand the field a little bit, it's a very mechanistic field, and the people that tend to be drawn to work in it are very mechanistic and always asking why and understanding why things are happening and what's the underlying mechanism to explain that. It also tends to be pretty quantitative, and that doesn't necessarily mean like complex equations and math, but it's thinking about numbers a lot, because we're constantly measuring things at pretty fine spatial and temporal scales, and that results in a lot of data. And so, yeah, it just tends to be fairly quantitative and data intensive. And so we'll be working with a decent amount of data in this class, not a ton. We'll be working, we'll have assignments where you'll either have to complete them in Excel, or if you work in R or some other stats software, you can use that. But if you don't have a lot of Excel background, be prepared to get on YouTube and figure out how to do some things, because that's a requirement of the class, but not part of what I teach in the class. So you'll have to find some of those resources elsewhere if you kind of fall into that category. But again, the math isn't very complicated, so I think even if you don't have a lot of Excel experience, it's all doable. It's also instrument and method intensive, and I put both of those things because a lot of times there aren't instruments sold by companies to make the measurements we want, so we kind of put things together and figure out how to measure it ourselves. So it's not really an instrument per se as developing new methods to measure new things that are occurring, in plants as they respond to different environmental conditions. So in our labs, we'll use some of this instrumentation, some of the equipment that's commonly used in ecophysiology, so you get some experience in how that works and what the kind of theory of operation of these different techniques are, because that's really important to understanding and interpreting the results. If you don't really understand the instrumentation, sometimes the numbers it spits out aren't really that meaningful. So we'll spend some time on that in lab as well. And then I just wanted to say, to really, if you're going to go into ecophysiology, having a background in biology is helpful. It's certainly not required. And in this class, it's not required either, but we will be talking about cellular level processes at some points throughout the course. And so if you don't have a background in biology and kind of that small scale processes and structures, the textbook we're going to use has sections of each chapter that talks a little more about the processes and structures on that scale. But if that's not enough for you and you want a little more background information on something we're talking about, let me know and I'll try to find, I've got some biology books and plant physiology books that might be helpful in explaining some of those things to you. So you don't have to have that background to be successful in that class, but I want to point it out because sometimes if we're getting into that nitty gritty and you're just like, oh my gosh, I don't know, what he's talking about, just let me know and we can get some resources for you so it makes more sense to you. Okay. All right. A little more about the field and kind of what we'll be talking about in this class is I just wanted to talk about adaptation and acclimation to make sure we're on the same page with the definitions of these two terms and how they apply to ecophysiology. So adaptation is really the differences between species in their ability to tolerate different environmental conditions. So this is talking about evolutionary adaptation. So as there are mutations that cause changes in the structure and function of plants, and those new structures and functions or different structures and functions are better suited to a certain environment, that is, an adaptation towards that particular environment. So that's happening over long periods of time and results in interspecific differences or differences between species and how they function. And not only species, genotypes as well, of course. But species is a little easier one to conceptualize. And so when we think about adaptation, a lot of what we're thinking about is the spatial distribution how the physiological processes of a plant constrain it as far as the environmental conditions it can survive and grow in. And then also within a community, how are the different species in that community behaving differently, and how do they all contribute to overall ecosystem function? So that adaptation piece, we're really focused on differences in the plant community or differences in the distribution of species over space. Okay, so that's adaptation, much longer time scales to achieve changes in physiology. Acclimation, on the other hand, is adjustments an individual plant makes to its environmental condition. So whether that's an annual plant or a perennial plant, a plant can adjust to some degree in response to some environmental condition. So I'm sure you've seen examples of this where maybe the two individuals of the same species are growing under different environments and they have potentially different structures or different physiologies or something's different about them. And that shows the ability of a plant to acclimate to slightly different conditions. And when we think about acclimation from an ecophysiological standpoint, what we're really thinking about is either seasonal patterns in physiology of a plant or interannual patterns or differences in physiology of plants. So how does a plant behave in a wet year versus a dry year? That would be related primarily to acclimation versus adaptation. So both of these factors that contribute to differences in physiology are interesting to people within the field of plant ecophysiology, and we will talk about them throughout the class, both of these types of mechanisms. And I think what I do is goes back and forth between these two things. I really like adaptation, and it's kind of where my mind goes a lot. So if you're looking for my biases, that's kind of what I think about a lot, interspecific differences. But we do a lot with acclimation and seasonal patterns in the lab as well. And a couple of my grad students that are in the lab are both looking at some of those factors that change over the course of the season. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a little oversight of kind of the impacts that the field of ecophysiology has had in the broader field of ecology and science in general. Just as a background, I think it's kind of interesting, and then you get to show cool pictures. So firstly, just quantifying photosynthesis and transpiration. It's really been the field of photosynthesis the field of ecophysiology that started thinking about not just that plants are doing photosynthesis, but like, what does that mean for carbon accumulation and the sequestration of carbon? And are all plants doing photosynthesis the same way or not? And are they all using the same amounts of water or very different? And to now that seems really like intuitive to us. But early on in the field of ecophysiology, that was a big question. We didn't know how different plants were in those functions. And so the field of ecophysiology, really, that's one of the areas that they started in, is just figuring out some of those differences. So when we talk now about understanding those differences in transpiration rates and photosynthetic rates, that's the field of ecophysiology that kind of identified that and pushed that idea forward. And I have this picture up here in the top right of this RV and trailer and tent and these two individuals out here in the desert. This is actually the first system, or one of the first systems, and it would be the first portable system for measuring photosynthesis and transpiration. We'll be using similar instruments in a couple weeks, and now they all fit in, a box the size of a shoebox. But early on, they had to have a whole RV to fit this system. And so Hal Mooney, who was one of the early pioneers in ecophysiology, this was what he did during his graduate school, built this and went around the desert measuring photosynthetic rates and transpiration of different plant species. C4 photosynthesis, the field of ecophysiology, it was really physiologists that identified it, but it was ecophysiologists that really took it from there and said, well, what does this mean? Like, what are the implications of a plant doing C4 photosynthesis versus C3? And we'll talk more about that. So if you're not familiar with C4 photosynthesis, don't worry about it. But it's a hugely important photosynthetic pathway globally. And it was really in the field of ecophysiology that they kind of like began to understand what that really meant for a plant to use that pathway. Also stable isotope integration into ecology. So we'll talk a little bit about stable isotopes in a few weeks as well. So if you're not familiar with them, that's okay. But it's a really, really important tool for tracking carbon and water cycles globally. So thinking about the entire terrestrial carbon and water cycle, stable isotopes are really integral for that. And it was originally used, was and still is a useful tool in geology, but it was ecophysiologists that kind of identified that tool and said, like, hey, we could use that to understand what's going on, in plants and how plants differ in their water use. Another big impact that ecophysiology has had over the years is ecosystem models. So now, we've got these models predicting changes in carbon sequestration and weather patterns and things with future climate scenarios. Those models got their start in large part from the photosynthesis model. And pretty much every big, large-scale ecosystem model incorporates this photosynthetic model that was developed by some ecophysiologists in Australia. And so they really took that model and then they thought, oh, we got this model on a leaf level, but if we blow this up to a larger scale, we can actually predict what's going on at, a regional scale and a global scale. And so that's where a lot of those models kind of have their roots. And then a lot of our understanding on how terrestrial ecosystems are going to respond to elevated CO2 started in ecophysiology, just kind of at the leaf level. This is this picture on the bottom right is a fairly early study that was done in Kansas, looking at how elevated CO2 was going to affect, my computer's a little slow. Go back. There we go. It was ecophysiologists that really wanted to understand kind of leaf level responses of plants, and then it kind of went from there to thinking about whole ecosystems and seeing how an entire plant ecosystem was going to respond to elevated CO2. So a lot of the early work in that area was from ecophysiologists as well. So just some areas that ecophysiology has impacted over the years, just to help you kind of think about how this field fits into the overall kind of ecology, natural resource, environmental kind of fields of science. So in this class, what we're going to focus on are really three kind of sections of the class. So when we think about ecophysiology, it's generally divided or focused on carbon, water, and or nitrogen. So one or all three of those. And of course, it could be phosphorus and other nutrients as well, but nitrogen is, of course, the nutrient we've studied the most. So when we talk about nitrogen, we'll really talk about all nutrients and some of the differences, but our focus will be nitrogen. So that's kind of what we'll focus on in this class to give you kind of a basis and a background in the field of ecophysiology. And one of the first things I said is how the field of ecophysiology scales a broad range, there's a broad range of scales within the field of ecophysiology. And so we'll talk about some of those scaling issues because, the field of ecophysiology really started by measuring leaf level processes, but then the question quickly became like, okay, well, you measured this on a leaf. Does that mean the whole plant is doing the same thing, or is there some differences when you scale from a leaf to a plant? And similarly, scaling from a plant to a whole ecosystem and to the globe, there's issues associated with the scaling. So we'll start talking about that a little bit to help us understand how we can interpret and incorporate leaf level information into our decisions we might make, policy decisions, management decisions, what have you. So that's kind of the overall structure of the course. When we're talking about carbon reactions, we'll focus on photosynthetic reactions. We'll talk about those processes and how they respond to the environment. We'll talk about respiration and then carbon movement and storage within the plant. For water, we'll talk about how plants uptake water and what the limitations are to uptaking water under different environmental conditions. We'll talk about quantifying transpiration and how stomates and the pathway of water movement affects the plant's ability to use water under different environmental conditions. We'll talk about some of the implications of that pathway of water transport have to do with the ability of plants to tolerate both freezing and drought. So we'll talk about that. When we talk about nitrogen and nutrients, we'll talk about those processes of uptake and how plants are using and recycling nutrients within themselves, leading to different kind of nutrient use strategies among plants. And then again, lastly, we'll talk about some of those scaling factors. All right, so that's a snapshot of what we're going to do. So just to kind of conceptualize that or capture that in a goal statement, my goal for this class is just to give you like enough of an understanding in ecophysiology to be dangerous, right? So like give you enough information that you can go and read some literature that's more related to what your interests are and be able to understand it, interpret it, and incorporate it into what you want to do as professionals in the future. So, I want you to be able to read and understand the principles. You can pick up a paper with ecophysiology and say like, yeah, I totally understand what they're doing. I understand the limitations of that, and I can see how I could use this information in my own research or my management. I want you to be able to analyze and interpret data a little bit. You don't have to, come out of this being a professional on every kind of measurement or type of data we talk about, but I want you to be comfortable with like, if you had to analyze some of that data, it wouldn't take you too long to kind of get back into it and figure out what you needed to do to get some meaningful information from that data. But really then the ultimate goal is that you take this information and make it your own. So you all have very different interests and goals in life, which is what makes teaching fun and seeing where you all take this information and how you start thinking about applying it. And so that's what will be interesting, and we'll be able to do more of that as we kind of move throughout the semester. And I already said we'll analyze and interpret some data, but I really do want to give you that hands-on experience. Not everybody learns this way, but I think a lot of people, you really start to learn and question things when you're trying to measure it. And for me, like I can say something in my head or conceptualize it or understand it like in words, but then when I go to try to measure it, then I think, well, wait a second, I learned this, but is that really what's going on? And so I think that's a good time to really think about what you've learned and kind of grok it, if you will. I had an employer that called it when you really understood something, it was grokking it. And so hopefully that process will help you grok some of this information in ecophysiology. Okay, so let's talk a little bit how we're going to meet those goals. These are just kind of very broad things. But I kind of have we meet 3 days a week, and each day is, in my head, is a little bit different. It'll flow a little bit. It won't always be this way, but in general, our Mondays are going to be days where we discuss literature that we've read. So I want to spend a lot of time getting us to read current literature related to the ecophysiological topics we're talking about, and think about how those processes can be utilized in the real world, so to speak. So that'll be more of a discussion day based on literature we've read. Early on, I'll pick the papers and kind of lead those discussions, but as we move through the course, there will be more and more student-led discussions where you can pick papers that are more interesting to you and lead a discussion on those papers. And we'll talk more about that as that comes up in the semester. Wednesdays are our lab day. So some days we'll be collecting data, some days we'll be analyzing data, some days we'll just be finding data online and we'll be processing that information. But that's more of a traditional lab day on Wednesdays. And then Friday is where I'll give you some lectures. So I'll introduce new topics here, make sure that you've got the important information from the book, you've identified that, and you know what you really need to focus on for understanding the literature in the labs. So that I'm just going to do all online. One, because for a lecture, we don't need to necessarily be in person. And then that adds more flexibility into your schedules. I know many of you are starting to think about field season already. And so that gives you an extra day to be a little more flexible if you need to get out in the field to set some stuff up or make some measurements. That online material will be asynchronous. You can do whenever you want throughout the week. Okay, so that's generally how we're going to go about meeting those goals. The readings, as I said, we'll do a lot of readings from the literature, and I'll assign those early on, and then we'll let you pick some of those as we move throughout the semester. So we'll constantly be giving you that material or PDFs of those assignments or those readings as we go throughout the semester. There is a textbook for the class. It's called Plant Physiological Ecology, appropriately, and it's the front cover of the current version is shown over here on the right. This book is available through the library, so you can go ahead and check it out and download the whole thing if you want. There will be large sections of the book we don't use, but there's a lot of important pieces of the book that we will use. Let's see. I think there's more I wanted to say about the book, but I won't worry about it now because it's not coming to mind, so it must not be that important right now. The assignments, let's see. We won't have a ton of assignments, to be honest. We're going to be doing data analysis together, and so I will probably give you some questions to answer at the end of those data analysis activities. There are a few exams. They will be take-home exams, open book, open notes. I just want to force you to think through some of the processes that we're doing, think through some of the equations we're using. So some of those on the exams, it'll be using those equations. But I don't want you to stress out about that. My view of graduate courses are that you are now in charge of your own education. I spent plenty of time in my undergraduate courses kind of policing and making sure everybody's staying on task and doing their work and all that kind of stuff. I don't want to do it anymore. You are old enough to decide what, when you do stuff, and you make sure you get it done. So I'm not going to have a bunch of quizzes associated with the readings. If you don't do the readings, you're going to struggle with the material, and you're going to struggle with the equations, and you're just going to struggle, on those exams and the other assignments we do. But if you keep up on those readings and you stay engaged in the material, you're not going to have a problem in this class. Nobody ever does. Never had anybody fail this class, and I've never had anybody do really poorly if they were showing up to class and participating. So I'm not going to police you with a bunch of assignments because that's a bunch of busy work for you and for me, and I don't want to go there. So that's my view of graduate courses and assignments. And because of that view, I think I don't have a lot of assignments set up right now. I've got a bunch of assignments I've given in the past, and as we go through the class, I might say like, oh yes, this assignment would be really good right now. We're going to do this assignment this week or next week. I'll give you enough warning that you can get that assignment done. But some classes are, you've got all the due dates done. My undergraduate class, I have all the due dates done right now. Everybody knows what the whole semester looks like. I want to keep this one more flexible. So if we want to take more time on one thing, or we need to take more time on some topic, we can, and it's not going to throw off the rest of the semester. So not a lot of assignments, and definitely not a lot of stuff assigned right now other than some readings. Okay, one note about the textbook. Each chapter is kind of got a couple sections. The early part of each chapter is more on that cellular level physiology or leaf level physiology scale. And then the second half tends to be more the ecophys part. So in the photosynthesis chapter, it talks about some of the detailed reactions going on during photosynthesis. But then the second half of that chapter is, well, how do these processes change in response to light conditions and temperature and water availability? So what I'm going to do is my lectures are going to be more associated with that cellular level physiology, or those kind of fine scale, small scale processes. And the reason is because, the book gives you all this information, and a lot of it isn't going to be super important for us. So I've kind of distilled it down to the most important pieces that you need to know to be successful in this class and to be able to get into the literature and really start understanding plant ecophysiology. If you want to figure out, and understand those cellular level processes, that's awesome. I'll be happy to talk with you more about them. But then maybe that's another class you would take to understand those processes in more detail. So that's kind of how the book is structured, each chapter. And so when I give you reading assignments, often it won't be a lot in that first part of the chapter, and I'll do lectures on that, and I'll send you to the second part of the chapter that's more ecophys. The reason I say that is because if you go to do a reading and you're like, I don't know what some of these terms means, well, it probably means you should go back and watch the lecture first. Maybe you didn't watch the lecture first before you read it. And so that might, so if you do it in that order, it might just make a little more sense and be easier. Okay. that's basically all I want to say. I guess what I'll do is just quickly show you Canvas. I know some of you have been there. One of my students already pointed out a mistake I had, so thank you for that. So hopefully you saw this page. I'm going to change our home page because you don't need to see this all semester long. This is a picture from this last summer from a group of people. So we put on a workshop, myself and several other faculty members around the country put on a workshop every couple years on ecophysiology. And so it's a 1 week crash course in kind of the measurement and data analysis of ecophysiological processes. And it is a super fun time. Every time we do it, it's fantastic. And so the goal of that workshop is really to give everybody like hands-on experience. We do almost no lectures. We just throw people, at an instrument and have them start collecting data, and then we talk about it throughout the course. And so we do that a little bit. We're trying to do lots of hands-on experience because it's more fun and hopefully we learn more. But then we'll have a little more lecture time in our classes. But I think physiology is super interesting. I have so much fun doing it and thinking about it. So hopefully you all have a good time in this class and find some enjoyment and interest in the topic as well. Okay, so I will switch our home page to what is our modules page. Right now, I've only got 2 weeks just because so much stuff has happened in the last week, and I've had to make so many adjustments already in week 1 that I have not been able to get all of the content kind of updated and moved over to this new semester of Canvas. So I've got the first 2 weeks for you. Right now, there's no video under this week because I'm recording it right now. I'll dump that on Canvas here in a little bit. And I will put some lectures for Friday on there as well. There's a few short videos starting to talk about photosynthesis that you need to watch sometime before next week. There is also a reading for next week. So that's in that textbook. If you click on this reading, I actually have a link to chapter 2 of that textbook. And this brings up a point that I did want to say. I'll post probably all the readings here as PDFs, but go to the library's webpage and go ahead and check out the book and download it through the library. What that does is it tells the library like, hey, lots of people are using this book, we need to keep it. If nobody ever goes to the library and checks it out, they're going to get rid of it and then we won't have access to it. So do that first, but just know, excuse me, I'll also try to provide the PDFs, but I promise you I'll forget like once or twice. So it's probably better if you just have it yourself. Anyway, so here's a description of what you need to read, just 10 pages. Read that for Monday so we can get started thinking about the light reactions in photosynthesis. But in general, I'll have our Canvas course divided into these modules, and each week of the course will have its own module. And I will have each day and the information going on each day laid out here within the module. So you can see in week 2, I've got Monday, hopefully will be an in-person lecture unless I get sick again or we have another ice storm. But I'll put our slides that we're going to talk about that day under here. If we've got any kind of readings or handouts you need to bring with you to class for lab, I'll post that under the Wednesday class. Friday, then when we have virtual lectures, which will be pretty much every week, those videos will be linked and the slides associated with them will be linked under that Friday. And then any readings for the week will be posted at the very bottom. And I just have, you can see, read by Friday, read by Monday. So just keep an eye on that. And note, these are not assignments. So if you look at the schedule in our Canvas page, it's not going to tell you to have it read by then. So really use this modules page for like seeing what you need to take care of at certain times. Because this is what I use. I don't usually look at the schedule very much, and I really rely on the modules page. So if you focus on this, you'll be in sync with me and kind of how I'm thinking about the class. Okay, I think that's it. There's probably important stuff I've forgotten. But I will see you all on Monday in person. So whatever questions you have, bring them with you. We'll answer them and get them taken care of, and hopefully get things smoothed out a little bit next week. And it's not, to be honest, this doing this week online isn't going to slow us down. We're going to cover all the same stuff. We're going to get all the same types of measurements done in lab. So it's not really a huge hiccup for us. So yeah, so hopefully you don't stress about that. And hopefully you're staying safe today and healthy. And I hope to see you next week. So take care. Let me know if you have any questions. And yeah, we'll see you on Monday.